Starting this hour straight away with Nigel Farage. Nigel has joined a new international campaign committed to reforming the World Health Organization, and this is set to launch today. Let's go to Nigel and find out exactly. Nigel, what's your issue with the World Health Organization?
Good morning.
Good morning.
So the World Health Organization, which is part of the United Nations, was set up and designed to be an early warning system. You know, something like SARS hit a few years ago, the rest of the world needs to know about it. And if it's there for us to share best practice, how we deal with problems, how we deal with new phenomena like COVID, and if we can all go there and learn from each other, that's terrific. No objections whatsoever. However, in 2 weeks' time, our government is committed to signing a new treaty. It'll be binding under international law, and that treaty would now give this organisation the power to, number one, in an emergency, take 20% of our PPE, 20% of our vaccines, which they would take and give to poorer third world countries. Number two, it would give them the right to declare a pandemic, a global pandemic, and they could tell us we have to lock down. Now, I think not only have we had enough of lockdowns, we can all now see that the approach that Florida took, the approach that Sweden took, where life carried on, albeit with a few restrictions, but life carried on was a better approach. So that shouldn't be removed from us. And anyway, it's for us to decide how we deal with health.
But do the member bodies of this organisation, the World Health Organization, do they not have a vote in all of this?
Well, the problem is we'll be giving authority to the World Health Organization just to do this. They would have the ability to say, right, there is a global pandemic, you must all lock down. Now, look, Brexit Britain, what was Brexit about? It was about taking back control. It was about us being in charge of these big decisions and not to give a bureaucracy, and one that's fairly questionable in terms of the way that it operates financially and much else. And look, in America, 49 of the Republican senators have got together, written to Joe Biden to say, look, let's try and reform the WHO. Let's not try and, sign this treaty. And what's happening in Britain is we're on the verge of signing this and there is no debate. There ought to be a public debate in Parliament where ministers explain publicly why they intend to sign this.
So, you've explained it perfectly there, because I was scratching my head. Why on earth is Nigel Farage bothered about the World Health Organization? But it comes back to that issue, doesn't it, as you said there, about sovereignty, about control. Now, the government have absolutely been adamant that no outside third party would be dictating whether or not we would go into a lockdown or not.
Yes, back to the days of the European Union, where no, the EU haven't really got power over us, and then you find that they have. British governments are very keen, whether they're Labour or Conservative, they love signing international treaties. They love being popular on the world stage, going with the flow. And time and again we found, on these issues of who's really in control, they don't actually tell us the whole truth.
But how easy is it ever to take back control? A lot of people would say the Brexit that you envisioned, the Brexit that you sold to the British population hasn't really happened. We haven't been able to take back control. Could that be the same with the World Health Organization? And isn't it better to have some sort of international overarching cooperation when it comes to a pandemic, which it by very nature is global?
I'm all for cooperation.
Yeah.
What I'm not for is surrendering the ability to make decisions, and they are two fundamentally different things. Look, the Brexit we've got, it hasn't worked out the way that I wanted, but all I ever said to people was we would be in control, and we might make a total mess of things, or we might do things very well, but we are in control.
So what way, ideally, would you see a reorganised World Health Organisation? Would we have a contributory vote, a voluntary vote? No vote? How would you see it?
Very simple. We should go to Geneva in 2 weeks' time for this big summit, and we should say to the bureaucrats, right, this is not what we intended. We are not going to give you the power to do all of these things. What we will do is use you as a coordination point where we can share intelligence and share best practice. And this thing needs to be reformed. And if you don't reform, we're going to stop making financial contributions and we will no longer play a part in it. And that's how negotiations work in life. You've got to threaten. You've got to threaten to get what you want. I suspect that if we make this stand, we'll find that other countries join us.
And you're talking about reform there. Is this move into this area part of your role as President of Reform, or is it totally separate?
No,
this isn't a position of reform.
This is completely non-party political in every way. It's just
apart from slight alignment with the Republicans in the States.
Well, yes, but I'm hoping that I'm hoping now that Democrat voices come out and say much the same thing. I mean, you know, the Americans are very, very big on sovereignty, regardless whether they're Democrat or Republican. No, this is non-political. It's a simple fact that it's your elected parliaments should make these decisions and then be held accountable to you at the next election.
So if people at home are listening to you this morning going, I agree with everything Nigel is saying, what can they do to ensure that in 2 weeks' time a proper debate is had?
Well, what we're doing now is we're collecting names. You know, Action for World Health, the website's all going up today. We're going to collect names of people who support us, want to help us. And when I've got this moving, in a couple of days' time, I will launch a petition on the government's website, and I'm hoping we get hundreds of thousands of people who say we should not do this without a proper parliamentary debate. And the fact that it hasn't even been discussed, I think, is wrong.
Well, who's there at the moment representing us?
We have a variety of people. We have doctors. We have all sorts of people that input, mostly on a part-time basis. You know, and actually, if you talk to the medical profession, you know, a lot of our top cancer specialists and many others have actually found this organisation to be very valuable over the last few years, and all the while it's operating on the basis of cooperation but not giving away powers. It can be a force for good, but it's heading now into territory that it shouldn't be going towards.
So you don't want to see it disbanded. You understand that there is a role for the World Health Organization. I mean, is there a risk, possibly, by starting this debate of undermining it rather than reforming it?
I think it undermined itself. I think the boss, Mr. Tedros, the boss of it, undermined it. He was put into that position with the substantial backing of China. And when the pandemic broke, he insisted to the world it was the wet markets that were the source of COVID-19. So his position actually is highly questionable.
OK, well, fascinating talking to you this morning. Thanks for coming in. Lovely to have you in the flesh so early in the GB News studio. People don't usually expect to see you this time here. Thank you very much.
If there was a pandemic, heaven forbid, ever to happen again, who do you think should have the final say in terms of how your life is impacted as a response? Well, the World Health Organization, they apparently think it should be them. Listen.
I believe the time is right for an international treaty or other legally binding instrument to provide the framework for a more coherent and coordinated response to future epidemics and pandemics. Whatever new structures or mechanisms are established, they must promote equity and galvanize the engagement and ownership of all countries.
So, I mean, there's been a lot of kind of toing and froing on the World Health Organization's pandemic treaty. Boris Johnson, actually, he was a signature to the article in the first place back in 2021 that kind of brought us into these conversations. They're voting on one of the final versions in May. There's been quite a lot of pushback to this, Daniel Moylan, and I think you put your name alongside that.
Well, Nigel Farage, as your colleague, has started a sort of campaign to reform the WHO, and I've signed up to that because I think it's in desperate need of reform, and I don't think they can be heard credibly on pandemic issues until they've actually dug into what the origins of the last pandemic was, because that, I think, is crucial. You can't understand how to handle a future pandemic if you don't know what started the last one. But I think the big important thing here is, and I'm fortunate I was one of a number of peers and MPs who had a meeting with the relevant minister recently to talk about it. The important things to remember before we get too panicked is that, first of all, we haven't actually seen the text of what this treaty says. Secondly, the minister assures us that a lot of the worst things in it have been taken out, and we'll be able to check that when we do see the text. And thirdly, he says that there won't be anything in it that will tie the government's hands in handling things in the best interest of the British people in the future. My only worry about that is that we often sign up to these things, I mean, like the Refugee Convention in the 1950s, and then discover that years later they're being applied in a very different way, and the courts are saying they should be interpreted. The Belfast Agreement and the European Court of Human Rights, or Convention on Human Rights, which we discussed earlier. So my worry is that there might be things in it that look fine now, but later might be interpreted some other way. But let's see the text before we get too excited about it.
Jeff Phillips?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not happening right now. And this Action on World Health are the organisers of this campaign, which Nigel Farage and Daniel have got behind to reform. I mean, I think the trouble is with all these huge bodies like World Health Organisation and the UN to a certain extent and anything like that, they've become, you know, these great big juggernauts that move very slowly, that they're, you know, tied up in bureaucracy. I do think it's important that there is a global organisation that acts as a sort of a monitoring and reporting system, because otherwise, you know, how would we know what's happening, you know, whether it's Ebola, whether it's avian flu, whether it's something...
Yeah, so you can have a standardised data set to catch that information.
And all of that sort of stuff. But I can't imagine that, you know, anybody of the 149 member countries are going to say, oh, yeah, that's fine, you just decide. I mean, I think Daniel's right, let's see the text. But let's see what, you know, what it says and what it proposes. I mean, I can't see any government signing up to it, can you?
Is that your way of saying you agree with Nigel Farage?
No, not particularly.
I thought that's the territory we were going down there, Jo.
No, I mean, I do, you know, broadly speaking, I think Nigel is probably using this as a bit of a publicity stunt, but I agree with Daniel, more importantly, that let's see the text before we start debating it in the House.
Well, many people, of course, will be familiar with Donald Trump. Do you remember his attitude to the WHO? He was having absolutely none of it at all, was he? Get out was his approach until Biden, of course, then came along and undid that.
You might have heard about the World Health Organization Pandemic Treaty. Now, the idea is basically that all member states in the UN will sign up to a plan whereby if there were another pandemic, the World Health Organization would have provenance over the worldwide response to that. In essence, all nations would respond in the same way. But along with that comes a number of rules about you cannot hoard certain things, you can't keep PPE for yourself, you can't keep certain medications for yourself. You have to make it available to other nations. You also have to make it available to the World Health Organization for free if they want to come and take it. It raises obvious questions about why would you want this global body to have control over you as a sovereign nation? It opens up questions about, well, if there was a decision to go into lockdown again, does the World Health Organization then tell all the member states that they must do that? We all respond in unison, thus taking away our ability to make our decisions on behalf of ourselves. Well, yesterday, a group of 14 senators sent off a letter to the federal government saying we need to walk away from our plans to join up. We should not sign this and we should not sign it into law. Liberal Senator from South Australia, Alex Antic, said today the Prime Minister received a letter co-signed by a group of 14 cross-party federal parliamentarians requesting the government walk away from the amendments to the International Health Regulations and the WHO Pandemic Treaty. A meeting of the World Health Assembly will commence on the 27th of May, just in a week or two's time, to vote on these instruments, which if passed, will transform the WHO from an advisory body to a supranational health body. Now, the UK in the last few hours has said that it will not be signing on to the treaty in its current form because it is worried, as we all should be, that it would take away their ability to operate as a sovereign nation. And can you blame them? Because when you look at the response of other countries apart from us during COVID, let's say Sweden, for instance, where they did what no one else did, didn't go with the lockdowns, didn't go with the mandates, took a completely different tack. And the results they had were identical, if not better in most cases, to every other nation in the world. They did something completely different and it worked. But if the WHO is able to tell you what to do, you don't have that ability to make that decision.
One of the reasons why Sweden did that, and nobody talks about this enough, is because they literally didn't have the power to. The government in Sweden has never given themselves the power to enforce mandates of injections on people, to lock down people's businesses, etc., and so on. Power to them. No government should have that much power over millions of free citizens. But you're quite right, they're now laughing all the way to the bank. Even with the UK making this bolshy move, and I must say I'm incredibly impressed, I cannot see Albanese doing this. I cannot see him pulling out. He has been in lockstep with everything the UN has done, and it bears mentioning for anyone who's unaware, the WHO, the World Health Organization, is the UN's health arm, so it's one and the same body essentially. He simply hasn't broken rank with them, even when it comes to Israel-Palestine matters, as we saw most painfully over the weekend. And when you look at this government's track record, whether it comes to digital ID, which is set to sail through any day now in our parliament, if you look at the voice referendum, if you look at immigration, their policies on immigration and what they have and haven't done around that, public opinion doesn't mean anything anymore. If this went to a vote, would the Australian people want us to sign up to this World Health Organization treaty? Absolutely not. But the Albanese government has proved time and time again, public opinion counts for jack. They have an agenda to roll out, and they are going to roll it out come what may.
Your point is well made. If this went to a vote, there's no way Australians would support handing over our sovereignty to some unelected, unrepresentative group based in, Geneva. So we should have a position where we want to cooperate, obviously, globally. If there's a worldwide pandemic, then we would want to cooperate, but not give up our autonomy. But if we were of a mind to give up our autonomy and say, we're going to give someone else the authority to tell us what to do in the event of a health emergency, the WHO would be the last organisation.
Their track record.
I mean, we only have to look back, 24, 48 months ago to see they stuffed up COVID something shocking. It was the WHO who said COVID is not transmitted human to human.
Correct.
So it will be OK.
Yep.
That decision alone probably cost hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of lives. They have proved they should never be trusted with authority. Sure, give advice, but we shouldn't be beholden to you. And as you said, when do we get a vote on these things? When do we decide who's in charge rather than have our politicians just sell us out?
Well, the World Health Organization were the biggest bunch of flip-floppers during COVID you've ever seen. They started out by buying into what China had told them, just unquestioningly.
Yeah.
And as you said,
they get a lot of money from China.
They just declared that, there was no evidence of transmission from humans, even though at that time, China was well aware of what was going on in their own country and they were taking precautions.
Well, the WHO spent more time trying to rename COVID so it had no connection at all with China and Wuhan than they did actually trying to keep people.
Oh yeah,
and
it was all about racism.
And then the World Health Organization said in the early stages of COVID that it did not recommend mask use because it thought mask use would lead to complacency. Then, of course, it changed its mind on that and decided that everyone should be wearing masks. They made it up on the hop. And we want these people in charge of our response. I thought the one lesson we learnt from COVID, if nothing else, was that sovereignty is sacrosanct because we realised very quickly when we were removed from the rest of the world exactly how reliant we had to be on ourselves and the position we found ourselves in because we ran out of things. We didn't have stuff. We went, oh, hang on a minute, we better sort that out. And now we're going straight back to old ways. Yeah, let's centralise it.
I've launched a little campaign today to say that the government should not sign us up to the pandemic treaty. I think it's a very bad idea. I think I want the WHO to be a place where we can work together, we can cooperate. But to give the WHO that level of power would be absolutely mad. Well, I'm joined by Amesh Adalja, senior scholar, Johns Hopkins Centre for Health Security. And I want to make this point, Amesh. I want the WHO to be somewhere we can work together, cooperate, share best practice, be a sort of early warning sign, if you like, for many of these things. But the early days of COVID-19, it looked like they were doing their best to cover up for what had happened in Wuhan. And now they want to grab just this enormous amount of power for themselves. I mean, it was never intended, was it, that the WHO should operate like this?
No, the WHO was meant to be a coordinating center where best practices were shared, where people had, as you said, an early warning system. But we did see major gaps in the early days of COVID-19, especially with kind of placating the Chinese or a lot of kowtowing to the Chinese about what was going on. And there was a delay in us knowing that this was actually spreading efficiently from person to person. And we also had similar problems with the Ebola outbreak in 2013, 2014, which led to some reforms. But I think that, there's a lot of room for improvement with the WHO to make it what it really should be and a value to all the member countries.
Yeah, which I want it to be as well. Now, look, it's quite interesting that politically, all 49 of the Republican senators have written a letter to Joe Biden saying don't allow this dramatic centralised power grab. I mean, do you see any prospect that countries will just, go to Geneva in a couple of weeks and say you're going too far?
I do think that there's going to be a lot of pushback, and I'm specifically concerned about the intellectual property issues that have arisen, because what we know is that intellectual property rights need to be respected, that's how we get the innovative medical countermeasures that help us with the next pandemic and outbreaks. And there's a lot of efforts to try and undermine intellectual property rights, and some of that is in that treaty language. And I think we need to make sure that the intellectual property rights of UK and US and other companies that are going to be providing vaccines, developing them, that's respected. And I think that may end up derailing the pandemic treaty as we see it now.
OK, well, I tell you what, Amesh, I hope you're right, because we're going to be following this very closely over the next couple of weeks. Come back and join us as this story develops. And thank you for joining us this evening on GB News.